evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to tonight's webinar, which is being brought to you tonight by the Teagasc advisory staff here in County Mayo. My name is Brendan Garry. I work in Teagasc Ballinrobe, and tonight, for the next hour, I'm delighted to be your host. And indeed, this is the first episode of our new spring series of webinars, which will run for the next 5 weeks, each Wednesday night at 8 p.m. on a range of topical issues. Tonight, however, the focus switches to looking at best ways at achieving low-emission beef farming in 2022 and beyond. And we know that with the new Climate Action Plan signed into law recently, agricultural systems will have to lower its emissions by 22 to 30% by 2030. So tonight we're going to examine how we can do this as best as possible. Now joining us tonight is Alan Nolan, Beef Advisor from Teagasc Ballinrobe, who's going to give us some practical steps that farmers can implement to lower their emissions at farm level. While later guest speaker Michael Houlihan from Bord Bia and is the Agri-Sustainability Manager, will inform our viewers on how best they can manage carbon footprinting at farm level. And indeed, Mick will also show us how this can be done with Bord Bia reports. Now, you, the viewers, are being encouraged to engage with our panelists here tonight through the Q&A function, and we'll try and answer as many of these as possible live tonight. And any unanswered questions will be followed up afterwards in the coming days. And later this evening, Vivian Silke, Teagasc Regional Manager here in County Mayo, will put your questions to our panelists. So please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available to watch back on the Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel in the coming days. So without further delay, I'm now going to ask Alan Nolan there from Teagasc Ballinrobe to start sharing his presentation with us. So it's over to you now, Alan.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brendan, and welcome to all our listeners out there tonight. No matter how many times we do this, it takes a bit of getting used to looking into a screen doing this. But look, as Brendan introduced it there this evening, we're all hearing about emissions in farming over the last year or two, and it's a big topic out there, and sometimes it causes a little bit of anger and frustration among farmers because they kind of feel the finger has been pointed at them a little bit. But look, I think my role this evening is to try and simplify it. We're not going to go into the science of it in any major in-depth. It's to kind of see what sort of practical actions we can put in place on suckler and beef farms here in Mayo to kind of try and reduce the emissions that we have on our farm. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm going to aim to do there this evening. So you might ask, like, why should we be concerned with greenhouse gas emissions, or why should we bother? There's sometimes that question, like, out on farms. Look, we're exporting 90% of our beef. We're mainly beef farmers and suckler farmers here tonight, and we're exporting 90% of our beef out of the country. So we need to protect and grow our food markets. The consumer is getting more choosy the whole time in what they're looking for, and they're demanding that the food that they get, that there's low emissions in it. So it's going to be kind of a growing issue the whole time. And even on a webinar that I was on this morning, we've heard about the growth in organic beef in Ireland and across some of our European countries in France and Germany over the last number of years. So the consumer market is driving some of this as well. Look, at climate change impacts us all. So we've all seen in recent times about the storms and the flooding in this country. It's not just something that's happening on the other side of the world, it's affecting us all. And as farmers, that's affecting you as much as anybody because you're out there farming in all sorts of weather. So we have a social responsibility to, I suppose, carry some of the burden as well too. As I've just shown a few minutes, like agriculture is responsible for a big portion of the emissions. So it's important there that we do carry some of the responsibility as well. Some of the good news there is that by implementing some of these measures that actually improves farm efficiency and can improve farm income, like the two of these can run hand in hand together. And that's what I'm trying to show this evening. And finally, I suppose most importantly there, policy is going to drive this anyways going forward. And the most recent climate action bill, the government signed in there that they want to reduce national emissions by 51% by 2030. And within that, agriculture has to reduce greenhouse gas emissions somewhere between 22 to 30% by 2030. And that's based on a baseline year of 2018. So look at how do beef farmers generate greenhouse gas emissions? Look at, again, as I said, I'm not going to get into it in a huge amount, but basically look at an awful lot of it comes in that we have ruminants, which is cattle and sheep on our farms, and they eat grass. And in the process of eating grass and converting it into meat or protein, methane is produced as a byproduct. And over 90% of this methane then is basically let out, the animals let it out in their breath or belched out. So methane is a huge part of the problem there. And within Ireland, agriculture accounts for over 93% on the methane side of things. So when we're talking about what are the big issues, methane is one of the big issues. And you've heard that on the news and on all the farming media over recent times. Another one of the greenhouse gases there is nitrous oxide, which is related to chemical nitrogen fertilizer. And then when you have the picture there of the slurry tanker, there's both a combination of methane and nitrous oxide as well. Carbon dioxide is there as well, but it's not a major issue on an agricultural side of things. So as I said there, methane is associated with ruminant livestock production, and it accounts for 2/3 of Irish agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And in an overall context, and this is why I suppose farming gets a little bit of flack in this country, is that in Ireland, agriculture accounts for 35% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the country here. And when you compare that to the EU average is down around 10 or 11%. And I suppose this just reflects the scale of agriculture within Ireland, and maybe then also that we haven't got a huge big scale manufacturing as well. But because we are the largest emitter, which agriculture is, it's important there that we're seen to be part of the solution and carrying out measures to try and improve the situation there. The next biggest one there would be transport. So look at how do we go about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions? Well, look at, there's a couple of different things here, and what I want to kind of show is that a lot of these things that we're talking about, we've been talking about them for a long number of years. A lot of them will improve the farm efficiency. They'll also hopefully improve farm profit as well too. So it's basically under all these headings that I'm just going to briefly talk under. So we're talking about soil fertility, slurry management there, talk about protected urea, better grassland management, which we've been on about for a long number of years, breeding there, and especially there having more productive animals, whether that's we're talking about suckler cows or whether we're talking about finishing cattle there, that we have cattle out there that are thriving and being productive, and that's a huge one there that we're going to touch on. Animal health is very important as well in the context of having animals thriving and being productive. The earlier age at slaughter, we'll touch on that. And finally then, I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but it's just to highlight that down the road, there is a lot of work and a lot of research work being done within Teagasc on various technologies there, such as feed additives, that hopefully in a couple of years, these might be more readily available at a reasonable price that may reduce the amount of methane that's emitted. But they're all in a work in progress at the minute. All I can concentrate on tonight is some of these earlier points that I'm talking about here. Okay, sorry there, no, it just didn't move on. Okay, so look at just the first one there is the soil fertility. So I suppose the first part of that is actually soil sampling. So we need to get farmers out soil sampling. I know a lot of you out there would have applied to the department for the recent soil sample scheme, and I know their work is on that some have been sampled, some are still waiting on it, but that's a good start. And then to follow up and get a nutrient management plan or a fertilizer plan where you're actually following a program there. And I suppose the first step then after that is lime. And it's hard to believe, but like lime is one of the key areas here that we need to be focusing on, because whether you're a sheep farmer, beef finishing, suckler farmer, you can put out lime. And it does make a very big difference, especially the year we're in this year with the price of fertilizer. It can release up to 80 kilos there of nitrogen in the ground. Phosphorus fertilizer will become more available. You get better use of chemical fertilizer that you apply and animal manures. And hopefully by doing that, you'll have a lower requirement for chemical fertilizer and in the process, reduce this nitrous oxide emissions. So it's important there that when you do have your nutrient management plan or fertilizer plan, that you apply the correct type of fertilizer at the correct time, which is near the grass growing season, and in the correct amount. Okay, and better soil fertility there will lead to improved grass production and hopefully more profit. Another aspect of this, and it's one you'd have heard a lot about, is the use of protected urea. And I know there's an issue out there, particularly locally, in terms of getting or sourcing protected urea. It's not overly available out there. but we still have to try and persist and try and use it. And where I would say that you should use it is any of you that have been using canned fertilizer over the years there, that you try and replace canned fertilizer with protected urea. If you've been using compound fertilizers, the likes of 18612, you can still continue to use them, but it's where you're using the canned fertilizer. If we can try and get movement on that to try and replace it with the protected urea. Protected urea has 71% lower nitrous oxide emissions than canned fertilizer, and it has less ammonia emissions than the normal urea, 15.5% versus 3.5%. And even with the high prices there at the minute, it's still cheaper per kilo of nitrogen versus the canned fertilizer. Okay, so that's the soil fertility angle there. Just moving on to slurry management as well, which is a critical aspect of it. The first part is to have adequate slurry storage so that you have control on when you put out your slurry. So adequate slurry storage is important. And on a dry stock side, we should be fairly okay on that. It might be a bigger issue on the dairy side. And then when it comes to applying, I suppose one of the big technologies there that we can be using, and has happened over the last few years, there has been a big switch to the low emission slurry spreading equipment, or the LESS as you'll call it there. So we have seen the progression here that I've shown in the pictures, where we used to have the splash plate down here to the likes of the dribble bar. And then we have down here in the bottom picture, a trail and shoe machine. Okay, so what this equipment does is that it reduces the ammonia emissions. You're spreading it, as you can see here, in lines rather than spreading it all over in a blanket spreading on the ground. So there is less ammonia emissions then. So it's retaining more of the nitrogen there for use for grass growth. So you have an extra 3 units of nitrogen there per 1,000 gallons of cattle slurry. And again, hopefully there's less chemical fertilizer being required. So look at some of this stuff will be covered in next week's webinar again, so I'll move on in it. The other important part here, and again, it's very topical, is the timing of the slurry application. So the spring application is best, and a target we should aim for there is getting 3/4 of our slurry out by the 1st of May or the end of April to get better use of it. But just because the close season is now open, if you want to call it that way, and there's been a good smell of slurry the last 2 or 3 days where slurry has gone out. But just because you're allowed to put out slurry doesn't mean that you go and fire it all out now straight away. We had a lot of rain there yesterday anyways too, so you should try and apply more of it closer to the growing season, when soil temperatures are over 6 degrees and when the grass is ready to really grow and make use of that slurry. And try again there to apply in cool, damp conditions and avoid really sunny days in the summer, because that's where you're going to get loss of nitrogen in the slurry. So as I said again, some of that stuff on fertilizer and slurry will be covered there in next week's webinar. Just looking at grazing management, like this is something again that we've spoke about for a long number of years, and people mightn't realize that this does help in terms of reducing the amount of emissions that we're producing per kilo of beef. So what are the things that we're looking for there? One of the things is a longer grazing season. So if you can get your cattle out earlier, there's going to be less silage and meal required, which will have less emissions there. We're going to have less imported meal, less machinery work, and there's less slurry and less silage making. So a longer grazing season there is important. Cattle will thrive better as well too when they're out on grass, when they get out onto early grass. So that's another good advantage. We want to try and maintain the grass quality as well. So that's one of the key areas over the summer. So you need a paddock system in place. And I've shown the pictures here of just 2 farmers that I'd have had. This is one in North Mayo, just showing a paddock system in place with a simple trot there in the middle, dividing the field. And this is another one here in the middle of the county, just a trot in the middle of a big field. You have your fence going up and down and dividing it in 4 different ways. So you need the paddock system in place first. That's to give you control. Because without the control, it's hard to control the grass quality. But the key thing there when we're talking about grass quality is the pre-grazing height. So we're trying to get in there at 8 to 10 centimeters, no more than the 10 centimeters, so that you're getting in there at the correct heights. When you do that, you'll have faster regrowths. You'll have more leaf in the grass that you're eating, less stem. And when you have that, you have more fertilizer efficiency as well too, better quality grass, and the cattle are thriving better. So that's a key thing there. Grass measuring, for those of you that can do it, is a big benefit as well too, or at least walk your farm on a regular basis so that you're eyeballing it and managing it in your own head as well in terms of grass ahead and trying to maintain that quality. So what's the benefits of all this? Well, look at it's better animal performance there. It's lower cost to you. And by eating better quality grass, we produce less methane. So if you're eating more stemmy grass, there's more fiber in it, you're actually producing more methane then in that kind of stronger, stemmier grass. So if we can get cattle eating leafier grass, they're going to perform better and they're producing less methane. And by thriving better, we should be able to finish them quicker or move them on quicker as well. Okay, so there's big benefits to that as well. Just briefly, I'm only going to touch on this, is the white clover and multi-species. Some farmers are good at this and have tried it, but we've heard for years about the benefits of white clover. It helps there in that it fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. So again, by doing that, that can help to reduce the amount of chemical nitrogen that we need in the farm. And I suppose that's the whole aim of it. And that will again help to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions. Look, it can be oversown or you can do it in a full reseed. But from my experience, white clover, it needs a bit of management. It's not just something you can oversow and walk away and hope that it'll grow. You know, your grazing management is critical. You need to keep the grass height down low. Clover needs light, especially there around April time of the year to get going. The soil fertility is very important as well, that the pH is correct and that your P and Ks are good as well. So they are critical there. But just to highlight that this is something more of a longer one that we'll say if you're planning ahead over the next 3, 4, 5 years, something you can do, incorporate more white clover into your grazing swards is something that you can do. And this one, the multi-species sward, look at, this is a field I took of a farmer outside Ballinrobe that tried it there this year. You're talking about there, you're putting in a mix of grasses along with the likes of chicory, plantain, white clover, red clover. So there's a mix of clover and herbs there. There's better drought resistance because you have deeper roots. It's good palatability there. Cattle and sheep like it. But again, I suppose in terms of a problem there is a problem with persistency in that some of the plants are dying out there after 2 to 3 years, especially if they're not looked after right. And again, soil fertility is an issue. But look at the other big advantage is that there's way lower nitrogen requirements. So in the era that we're kind of in at the minute of high fertilizer prices, it's something that farmers are going to look at. And I know this was one that was sown for the purposes of REAP this year, and maybe in more environmental schemes going forward, there might be encouragement for sowing the likes of these crops. Okay, so again, that's more a longer term issue moving forward over the next 3 to 4 years. Just moving back here to the animal side of things, and I'm conscious of time just watching it, but looking at suckler cow efficiency, and really this is a big one for the suckler farmers that are listening tonight, because this has a big impact on it. So just looking at 6 key areas here that can have a big effect. So the earlier age at first calving. So again, a national average figure we have there for 2-year-old calving is 23%. But if more farmers can move that figure upwards or get more farmers calving at 2 years of age, it will have a big effect. I know a lot of farmers maybe don't like doing it. There are various different reasons they say for it. Calving reasons are not being able to get them back in calf again. But this does have a big effect on the national infantry, and it is a big way that you can reduce the emissions on a suckler farm that you have. Having a shorter calving interval. So basically what we're talking about here is having more productive cows, better fertility in them. And again, what we're talking about here is the national average is about 395 days or close to 400, is hovered around 400 for, I'd say, the past 10 years now at this stage. And we're really targeting to get that down as close as we can to 365 days. And if you get that down as close as you can to that 365, again, you're improving your situation. And improve the calves per cow per year. That national average is 0.86. So that what effectively that means for every 100 cows we have in the national herd, we're just producing 86 calves, or there's 14 cows out there with no calf. A lower replacement rate as well. So again, if you've a herd there and your replacement rate is high, you have a big turnover of cows there. Again, that's an inefficiency there on the farm. And just a figure there again that's taken off the calving report that some of you that are in ICBF will see is that the average calvings per cow out there is 4.5. And again, when I throw out that at discussion groups, a lot of farmers would always say to you, oh, it has to be 7, 8, 9, but it's actually only 4.5 when you take into account the cow that you sell that has only had 2 calves and 3 calves. So that's another figure we could improve. More calves born from AI sires. The national average at the minute is 16%, so that's gone down in the last few years. And why I put that in there is that you'd be using sires that have high index, more 4 and 5 stars with higher reliability. So you'd hope there that you have a bigger range of bulls out there with high index figures and good reliability. Okay, and the last thing there is just improve the 6-week calving rate. And I suppose where that improves there is that the more compact your calving is, the better it will be from a grassland management point of view too, and it'll be easier to manage your grassland. So look, at those things are key there, especially this calves per cow per year, the age at first calf, and the replacement rate. If we could improve them, it would really improve the emissions there on beef farms. Other issues there, just looking at lifetime performance of cattle, the animal health, I said, is critical. If you haven't got healthy animals, they're not going to thrive. So that's something that always needs to be looked at, and it's something we'll touch on again on maybe other webinars or events. Performance at grass, as I said, is important. I've covered that. Silage quality is important. So we're in the middle of winter now, but if your silage quality isn't good, again, cattle are eating stemmier silage, more fiber in the silage. There's more methane being produced in that. So again, it's back to the very same as the grass. If you have better quality silage, cattle are going to thrive better. Hopefully you can move them on and finish them quicker, and there's less methane being produced. The age at slaughter there is one again where there's a lot of potential in it. A lot of cattle could be finished at a younger age, and like Paul Crossan produced figures there at a recent beef conference that for every month earlier that cattle are slaughtered, it's a reduction of 250 kilos of CO2 equivalent. So it does make a big difference, and it does reduce the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions. The big but I'll put in there is it cannot come at the expense of higher meal feeding, because if it comes and there's a big increase in meal feeding, it's only going to offset any of those gains. So there might be no net reduction then in the greenhouse gas emissions. So one thing I'd highlight there is that if we could, is to try and avoid these long store periods, which does exist on farms, that cattle go through a store period there, which means then that they're being slaughtered close to the 30 months and well beyond it in some situations. There's still a lot of cattle being killed well over the 30 months. And to do that and monitor your performance, we need more farmers weighing cattle and monitoring their performance on an ongoing basis. So look, I'm just going to move on quickly. Like, that's just a checklist that's available there. Brendan might put it up on our social media channels. I know you can't see it there. It goes through 25 points that could help you on your farm to go through some of the areas that I've mentioned there. And as a kind of finish up tonight, okay, Brendan, I just want to highlight 3 farms there that we have that are part of a signpost program. And the signpost program, there's 100 farms nationally in it. They're across all enterprises, but within that there's the Future Beef program, which is 24 suckler farmers, and the Dairy 500 is a number of dairy calf to beef farmers. So within the county here, one of the farmers we have is Cathal Irwin, who's in Ballyhane, just outside Castlebar. And look, you can read some of the details there just on Cathal's farm. Like, he's a suckler farmer, 20 cemental limousine cross cows with a Charlie bull. So he's very similar to what a lot of people will be doing here. And in Jarlath's situation there, he's in a calf to beef system. He's buying 80 male calves, kind of all out of Frisian cows. They're Holstein, Frisian, Angus, and he's finishing them all to beef there. And both of the Cathal and Jarlath are doing a very good job in grassland. They're both grass measuring, paddock systems in place. Okay, so that's their systems. And they're just the third one then, briefly, just to mention, I suppose, the one I'm most familiar with, because I've been dealing with Michael and Niall Biggins farming in Glencorrib. They have 45 hectares of land there, again, well laid out in paddocks. They're calving 65 spring calving cows, again, mainly with Charlie bulls, some AI, and selling calves as weaning there. And again, they have excellent cow figures. And just to mention one thing there, they're in the Bord Bia Quality Assurance Scheme. They have a carbon footprint figure that came back to them there in the report of 12.47, which is just below the average there for the suckler farmers in that beef sustainability scheme. So it's something Mick will mention there later. And again, their future plans, the same as Cahill and Jarlath is to continue to reduce their carbon footprint figure, maintain and increase their profitability over the next few years, because that is critical there over the next few years. So hopefully you'll follow the progress of the three farmers over the next 4 to 5 years in those programs, and we will be highlighting their progress on social media and at events over the next number of years. And the final slide then, Brendan, is just a kind of a shopping list as a going away for all the farmers out there, that there is a few issues you can actually do straight away there this year to lower your greenhouse gas emissions. And by actually doing it, it's also compatible with good farming and actually profitable farming. Every farmer can apply lime, and you can do that straight away. Just maybe watch the silage ground in the springtime. Most farmers can do the low emission slurry spreading, especially if you're getting a contractor to do it. Nearly all the contractors have it at this stage. Aim to apply 75% of your slurry before the 1st of May. Replace the canned fertilizer with protected urea, and use your ICBF Calving report there to make breeding decisions and culling decisions there. Try and get those inefficient cows out of the system there. And for suckler farmers with weanings and even farmers finishing cattle, try and do more weighing of the cattle and monitor the performance of cattle out there. And if we do that, look, I think here in Mayo, we have a good story to tell. And as you can see in the picture there, it's a nice picture and a nice image we have here of beef farming in Mayo. So looking at that, Brendan, I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Alan, there. Now, look, as you give us a great overview there on the main mitigation measures there the farmers can implement there at farm level. So look at Alan, we'll let you draw your breath there. And indeed, at this stage now, I'm going to ask our guest speaker, who is Michael Houlihan from Bord Bia. And Michael is going to give us an overview there on the whole area of carbon footprinting at farm level. So I'm now just going to ask Michael just to start sharing your screen, Michael, and your presentation. So it's over to you now, Mick.
Grant, thanks very much, Brendan, and thanks for having me on this evening. So look, over the next little while here, I suppose I'm going to try and cover off and pick up on some of the points I suppose that Alan was making in relation to the emissions and carbon footprinting and the role I suppose that we in Bord Bia play in the whole area. And I suppose the key things that we want to focus on over the next few minutes is how I suppose the carbon footprints are calculated. The farm feedback report that Alan just mentioned there a moment ago, we'll dig into that a little bit and just kind of take you through that, explain what's in there and how to interpret to an extent, and then finish off by outlining where you can find your own carbon footprint for the farm. So I suppose the first thing to say is that as part of the beef and lamb assurance scheme, the dairy assurance scheme, every time we go and do an audit on a farm, we're doing a carbon footprint assessment of that farm as well. And we started this process on beef farms in 2012, and since then we've over 280,000 carbon footprints calculated for beef farms in Ireland. Similar on the dairy side, we've been carbon footprinting since that scheme was introduced in 2014, and we've over 70,000 carbon footprints calculated for dairy farms. So I suppose that in itself is hugely significant. There's no other country in the world, doing that level of detailed measurement on farm as we are. And I suppose a lot of the time when we think of countries that are similar to ourselves in terms of the importance and significance of agriculture to a country and to an economy, we automatically think of New Zealand. But it's only next year where they're actually moving to a situation where they're hoping to start auditing and creating a carbon footprint for all of their farmers. So I suppose look, we're definitely probably the first movers in this space, and because we have so much of it done, it means we've an awful lot of information under our belts, and we've an awful lot of information there that we can use to kind of put forward the good story that we have to tell around Irish beef production. So to move on and talk about the farm information that's used and that's important when it comes to calculating the carbon footprint, we get this from a number of different sources. And I suppose here from the Bord Bia audit is a very important source of information for us. And anyone that's a member of the scheme will be used to auditors asking questions around, the grazing seasons, and when the animals go out in the spring, when are they housed again for the winter, asking questions around the types of fertilizers that are used, the amount of fertilizers that are used, around concentrate feed, then how much concentrate feed is used and is being fed to the different types of animals on the farm. Questions around manure management, so looking at slurry, when slurry gets spread across the year, how it's applied, and again, some other questions around animal housing, around energy, and so on as well. So really important information kind of flowing through there from the Bord Bia audit when it comes to calculating the carbon footprint. After that, we look at the Department of Agriculture and the AIM system. And the animal information is obviously hugely important, given, I suppose, the contribution of animals themselves to the production of greenhouse gases on farms. So from the AIM system, we get the information in terms of the animal numbers, the breed, the age, the sex of the animals, movements in and out of the herds, births and deaths over the course of the year. So we get a really accurate profile of animals on that farm, and that in turn allows us to calculate monthly emission totals for animals on the farm then as well. The final source on the beef side then is in relation to ICBF, and we get information from ICBF in relation to live weight gain achieved on individual farms, looking at calving intervals, replacement rates. So some of the things that Alan has touched on there in his presentation as areas for focus and areas to try and improve in order to try and improve the carbon footprint and reduce emissions. You can, I suppose, see here from this, I suppose, why all that's relevant, because it's all information that gets used in the calculation of greenhouse gas emission totals for a farm and gets used in the calculation of the carbon footprint. So on this next slide here, it's probably a little bit awkwardly laid out, I suppose, in a way, but I suppose across the bottom here we have those sources of information that we've just talked about. Now we do have an additional one in here for the dairy scheme, and that's to do with information that we get for dairy processor in terms of milk deliveries. But essentially this information flows into Bord Bia's quality assurance system, so it's on our database. We've recently, in collaboration with Teagasc and ICBF, been going through a process of updating the carbon footprint in engines, so making them more accurate and taking account of more up-to-date research, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So ICBF, because they have much more accurate animal information, the actual calculation of the carbon footprint takes place within the ICBF database now, and that gets fed back into the Bord Bia system, and then from the Bord Bia system we can disseminate that information out there through the farm feedback report, giving people access to the carbon footprint, and then we obviously use it then for some of our own assessments in terms of how things are going in different sectors. So the sustainability survey that we've talked about a bit already, the information that's gathered there, that's gathered on the farm, it goes into the calculation of the carbon footprint, it goes into the calculation of the grass-fed status for that farm, and the information that gets presented in the farm feedback report as well is a reflection, I suppose, of what we capture in the audit. And that's an important point to kind of note as well, and we'll talk about later on. How accurate the figure that you end up with in terms of carbon footprint is very dependent on the accuracy of the information that goes in there. And what we're trying to do, I suppose, is capture information in relation to farm activity and farm inputs. And it's the emissions that's associated with this farm activity and farm inputs balanced up against the outputs, so balanced up against the beef produced on the farm or the milk produced on the farm, that we use to generate the carbon footprint. So it's a balance of one against the other. And really, I suppose, one of the best ways of looking at a carbon footprint is looking at it as an efficiency measure. So the lower the carbon footprint, the more efficient a farm operation is. Just in terms of what the general range of carbon footprints for beef systems is, as I said, we've been tracking the carbon footprint on beef farms for a long time now. We have data here on this slide here going back to 2014, and what this is telling us is the average carbon footprint across all beef farms, and this is all a mix of all the different systems that are out there, in 2021 was 10.39 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of live weight gain on beef farms. So I suppose the trajectory here, it is decreasing. It's I suppose a relatively small decrease that we're seeing and over the years, but the general direction of travel on that is good. Just to touch on something that Alan said there a while ago in relation to one of the farmers he mentioned and their figure, and the figure was up around 12.2 or 12.3 or something like that, and that's I suppose reflective of the system. Like in here, we're looking at an average figure of 10.4, say, but that's across all beef systems. So that's your suckler to beef, your suckler weanling systems, your dairy calf to beef systems, your bull beef systems, and everything and so on. So I suppose there's quite a range of average carbon footprints across systems. But the other thing I suppose I'd highlight on this as well, and I know it's quite small here, but we have a figure here in terms of what sort of a carbon footprint do the top 10% of farms have. And the top 10% of farms are achieving a carbon footprint of 7.22. So the lower the number, the better the better it is. And when you compare that against the farmers that are in the bottom 10%, their figure on average is 15.23. So the best or the most efficient from a carbon footprint perspective have a footprint that's more than twice that of the poor performers in relation to carbon footprint. This next slide, though, I won't dwell on it too much, but when we calculate the carbon footprint, we look at the different sources of emissions on the farm as well, and this is reflected in the feedback report as well. But I suppose on this slide here, the main thing we wanted to point out is this blue box here. These are the emissions associated with the cattle. So this is really kind of coming back to your methane emissions from cattle, and this is on beef farms on average, it's generally always in around the 50% mark. And in a way, look, if you have cattle, you have emissions, and there's no getting away from that. And in a way, these emissions are almost like a fixed cost in the system. Now, that's not to say that there can't be things done that will help to reduce that, or there isn't new technologies maybe coming down the line that will help reduce that. And over on the right hand side here, Alan has already outlined, some of the measures that can be used or can be targeted, I suppose, for individual farms to try and tackle the emissions associated with cattle there. To move on then, I'm going to talk about the farm feedback report. So I suppose this report was something that we started to roll out just over a year ago now. So anyone that's done a Bord Bia audit in the last 12 months should have received a farm feedback report as well. It looks a little bit something like this. We'll go into it in a little bit more detail over the next few slides here now. And in this, I suppose what we're trying to do is give the farmer information in relation to their own farm. So what is the carbon footprint for their farm? How does that stack up against similar type farms? How has that changed since their previous assessment? And this, what we have on the slide here, I suppose, is a sample, and this is included in all the reports, and it just kind of sets out how to kind of view the report or the following pages in the report. To get into it in a little bit more detail then, one of the sections that we look at is greenhouse gas emissions. Every report for each individual farm will include the carbon footprint for that farm. So in this example here, the most recent assessment was for 2019. The figure was 13.34 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo live weight beef. And on this particular farm, there was a reduction of 4% in terms of the carbon footprint on this farm. Now, we also have a benchmark figure over on the right-hand side here. So this is a suckler to beef farm. And this 12.4 figure is the average for all suckler to beef farms in the country. So we can see that this farm in particular, it's above average for suckler to beef farms, but on a positive note, we can see that there is an improvement in terms of the carbon footprint for this farm. Then down here in this graphic, again, back to what we talked about on the previous slides, just trying to break down, I suppose, the sources of emissions on the farm here. So this farm in particular, you know, there's the largest proportion of emissions by far is associated with the cattle on this farm. So this is a farm that's fairly highly stocked. You know, they're not putting a huge amount of fertilizer through the system or feed through the system. So as a result, we have a higher proportion of emissions associated with cattle directly. And again, you know, in this is the current figure here in this dark green box. This is the figure from the previous assessment in this lighter green, and then this sort of a pale blue box is the figure for other suckler to beef farms in this case. To move on then, just to quickly look at some other features in the report, you know, we look at nutrient management. Again, this is based on the information that's provided by the farmer in the audit, you know, just a breakdown of when slurry is applied on the farm. So it's gone from a situation of where it was 50-50 spread in spring and summer to where it's gone to 65-35. So coming much more in line with this recommended timings here as well. Another thing just to note as well, in the report there's some feedback and advice, and this was the Teagasc contribution to the development of this report. So all the information in there is in line with what you'll be hearing from your Teagasc advisor as well. On the next slide here, we're staying with the nutrient management as an example. Again, what we're presenting here is the information that was given to us during the audit. So what we see here is that, you know, the farmer has told us, you know, these are the different types of fertilizers that were applied during the year. This is the tons of each of those fertilizer when they were applied, and again we have the comparison with the previous assessment. So we've roughly the same amount of fertilizer being spread on this farm in 2017 and in 2019. We look down here, I suppose. The chemical nitrogen application has actually dropped a small bit, and again that's something that will contribute to the improvement in terms of the carbon footprint. So look, there are just a couple of examples that I pulled out with a farm feedback report. There's other information included in there, but in the interest of time, just trying to give a few examples in terms of what's there and how to interpret it. I suppose the question now is, well, how do I get this farm feedback report? So anyone that's interested in accident, they can log on to this web address here. It's farm.bordbia.ie. That brings them to this screen here. And up in the top right hand corner, you see this login feature here. So if you click on that, it opens up a new page where you put in a username. The username is your herd number. And then it looks for a PIN number as well. Now, the PIN number would be sent to any member of the scheme when they get a certification letter or a renewal letter, but I wouldn't expect anyone to be remembering that or to have it off by heart. So we do have a function here where if you click on the forgot PIN button on this page, a text message will land into your phone pretty much straight away with this PIN number, and you can just log in then straight away. Once you log in, you're kind of back to this screen again. And over on the right hand side here, you have the option to pull up the farm feedback report. And once you click on that, then it'll open up the full report, the most recent report for your farm based on the most recent audit on your farm. So a couple of things, I suppose, that are maybe coming down the track. We are looking to I suppose we have a lot of interest or a growing interest in terms of getting carbon footprint information, emission information on a more regular basis. So we're looking to open up the sustainability survey so that farmers could complete it on an annual basis, and rather than every 18 months in line with the audit. Again, farmers can do this on that same portal, that farm.bordbia.ie, and log it in by the way we've just shown you, and we have the option here to update the sustainability survey here. And once this feature opens up, now it's not open for on an annual basis yet, it'll be something that'll be happening next month, but once it does, farmers will be able to go in and then work their way through the sustainability survey. There's a bit of an introduction here just to explain some of the different icons that appear as you go through it, and then once you get into it, you know, it's intuitive enough there. You kind of just fill in the boxes as you go, you pick your dates and so on, you turn on and off the areas as needs be or as relevant to your farm. Just a couple of things. I mentioned that we're going through a process with Teagasc and ICBF at the moment of updating the carbon footprint methodologies, and really what that's about is the, more recent research in relation to greenhouse gas emission factors, more recent research in relation to the impact of things like triaguria or less technology. That all needs to be accounted for in the model, and where that's happening on farm, that'll now get credited in the new updated model. In terms of some future developments that are possible in terms of improving the accuracy and the detail in those calculations, interested in looking at things like linking in with pasture base, interested in looking at the opportunity to kind of get information on feed and fertilizer from merchants. Obviously all that can only be done with farmer consent and permissions and so on, and it's probably a little bit down the track anyway. But so other things that we'll be looking at in the future as well is more country specific emission factors. So making sure that the calculations are more relevant for Ireland, looking at the role of sequestration in the models in the future. So look, it's an area, I suppose, that's ever evolving. The more research that's been done by Teagasc, the more of a case we can make for including these sort of updates into the carbon footprint calculations, and hopefully that'll all be reflecting positively then in the final figures. So look, that's it from me. I know it was a very kind of quick run through that. Thanks very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you very much there, Mick, for that. That was a brilliant presentation there on carbon footprinting and how it's measured, and I suppose look at future developments in relation to carbon footprinting. So now at this stage of the evening, I'm just going to get you to stop sharing your presentation, Mick, and there still is time there for you at home tonight to put your questions in. We have a good few questions there in there. So at this stage, I'm now going to hand over to Vivian Silke there to answer the questions and put them to our panelists. So over to you now, Vivian.
So thanks to Mick and Alan. I'll ask the questions. I'll let the two lads answer them. First one, I let Mick clear his throat there and get his thoughts together for a few minutes. First couple for you, Alan. Just, I suppose it's a comment and a question afterwards. A lot of complaints about the pipes blocking up on the LESS spreaders. Anything that the farmer can do to help with that problem?
Right, Vivian, keep the twine out, and twine and plastic and all that sort of stuff out of it. Like, it's the slurry does need to be very well agitated. That's the one thing with the low emission. It has to be well agitated. There was a contractor on a recent webinar there last week from down south, and I think he described it very well. He said the slurry has to be like soup. And he described that the macerator there, people think that it can chop everything. It cannot really. It's there to distribute the slurry to the pipe. So look, it does need to be a bit watery, and it does need to be well agitated. And there's no getting away from that. Even just keep the stuff out of it, any rubbish, plastic, twine, anything like that. Obviously, if the silage being pulled in or hay, it doesn't help as well there too. Like,
that's the biggest one that's under the farmer's control, Ellen, to just try and keep it out and not to be. I know some people at the weekends, the temptation is to shove in the bale up against the feeding barrier and let the cows munch through it for a couple of days, and that doesn't help, So that, along with hay, is hard to agitate and hard to push around the tank, as you said, Yeah. The next one, Alan, is directly related to one of your pictures. You have some nice pictures in the slide. Can multi-species swards be oversown on existing sward, or do you have to burn off and start afresh?
I wouldn't do it that way, Vivian. Like, one thing they do need is they need a very good seed bed, anyways, because some of the seeds that's involved there is very small. Okay, so when you have a very small seed, you need a pretty fine seed bed. Okay, so whether you do a plow or whether you just burn off and do a one pass, but kind of get a kind of a fine tilt, it does need a fine seed bed, anyways. And the other thing there, just to know, Vivian, like that you kind of sow it fairly early in the year as well to get established. So that's the kind of thing. But as I said to you then, I suppose just going back on it, soil fertility is important as well too. So that's another crucial thing if anyone is thinking about it. But look, there is more information on that, Vivian. I knew we were only touching it on this evening. There's probably other webinars that maybe cover that in full detail.
And just in case anyone was thinking about it, especially with the REAP and the new environmental schemes, Alan, is it an annual thing to sow multi-species, or does it persist and can it grow again in year two? Or
this is where the issue is with persistency, is that especially the likes of the chicory there is only lasting for about 2 years, I think, in some of the trials they've done up in Athenry. The plantain is lasting a bit longer. and obviously you'd expect clover to last longer. So that's the biggest issue at the minute. And then, so it's only lasting a couple of years, so you're coming back again in a few years' time and redoing it again. But I suppose the advantage it has, Vivian, is that if it's done right, you have little or no nitrogen fertilizer needed. And it is better drought resistance there, and there's good palatability, and animals perform well in it. But things need to be right, and it needs to be managed correctly too. It might be, that's why I was putting it there, it might be something there that farmers do on their 3 or 4 or 5 year plan rather than just straight off this year, whereas the lime and things like that is something you can do straight off.
Okay, Mick, a question for you, Mick, and it's related to pricing, I suppose. And it's a comment as much as a question, but is there a risk that a farmer's carbon footprint could be potentially used as a pricing tool by the processors in the maybe distant future?
I don't think so, Vivian, to be honest. I suppose, but first off, the factories don't have access to the carbon footprint number, bar a farmer gives it to them. You know, and we certainly can't give that sort of information to anyone without a farmer's consent. So first off, they don't have the access to it. Number two, I don't think it's a practical approach from them either. Like the vast majority of transactions between meat processors and farmers are transactional. So you know, this history, I suppose, of no kind of long-term relationships being built up between farmers and factories, you know, the whole absence of supply contracts and things like that doesn't kind of bode well for factories when it comes to kind of pitching one farmer against another in terms of emissions and carbon footprint. I would struggle, Vivian, being honest, to see it being something that would become a feature in terms of pricing when it comes to factories and their dealings there.
In the last week, Mick, but someone made the comment, or someone online, I forget, but it basically that your burgers, your meal out now anymore will have kind of an element of a carbon footprint on it, and will consumers make their choices based on that? And is that where your maybe report is helpful?
Yeah, and that's probably where you'll see, like it probably becomes more relevant. Like again, you know, when a factory takes in an animal, you know, when the time that animal is processed, all the various different cuts of meat on it could end up going to 20, 25, 30 different customers, you know. But, you know, the pressure is coming on them all the time in terms of, well, what are your figures? What are your figures in relation to emissions? What are the figures in relation to the farmers that are supplying you, you know, and what can you tell us? So there's a real interest in trying to figure out, well, you know, at least across the supply base of farmers that are feeding into them, but what do the figures look like, and how does that ladder up then into a carbon footprint figure, as you said, maybe for a burger or for a couple of steaks on a shelf or whatever it is. Now, you know, obviously we do quite a lot of customer and consumer research around the world, and there's always that element to it of you know, what are people interested in? So what are the things about products that appeal to people? What are the characteristics that they want, and what are they willing to pay for? And I would always be kind of, and maybe this is the farmer in me or the cynic in me, I'm not too sure, but is, you know, what people say in a survey versus what they actually do when they're in their supermarket can be two very different things. Now, I would say that there is always a cohort out there that, you know, I suppose, they have more disposable income. You know, price isn't as big a factor as it is for the majority of people, and they will have an interest in that sort of thing, and they won't mind paying a bit more if they feel they're doing their bit for the planet and the environment by buying something that has a label on it that says it's a lower carbon footprint. But it's, you know, it's the challenge, I suppose, is to get to that point.
Another question, which is somewhat related to that one, Mick, is why does the carbon sequestered on an individual's farm not get accounted for within your calculations? We'll say the hedges and the grasses and the biodiversity areas that are on most of our farms in County Mayo.
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. It's one that comes up a lot, and it's one that frustrates a lot of people and frustrates us as well. But ultimately, the models that we use to calculate the carbon footprint, the models were developed by Teagasc, but when they were being developed, they have to be developed in such a way, so they have to be developed in a way that it's been done with best practice guidelines and recognized international methodologies for calculating carbon footprints. And then once that's done, there's a whole process of getting that approach accredited. And the accreditation is really important in all of this, because then your customers out there say, right, well, okay, you have a model for calculating the carbon footprint and calculating emissions. It's an internationally recognized approach, and it's an accredited approach. But none of those accredited approaches that are out there at the moment factor sequestration into it. Now, that's not to say that they won't in the future, and there'll obviously be a stronger case building all the time. But one of the things that's needed to really build a case is more results from research. So I know there's an awful lot of research going on in Teagasc at the moment, and all with the signpost farms, that the flux towers going on, we have the deep soil sampling program that's going on as well, and that's all hugely important, because that'll feed into the research that's necessary to make the case to have sequestration included in the carbon footprint calculations in future. At the moment, we can assign a default value and apply that across the board, but you know, it's a very kind of ham-fisted way of doing it, because you know, we know that you know, you can go from one extreme to another when you look at soil type, with peat soils being emitters of carbon, to, you know, mineral rich soils and being much better sequesters of carbon. So it's something that obviously we all want to move towards, we all want to see happening in the future, and I think it's something that will happen in the future, but it's about building the body of evidence in the research to make the case for it.
Okay. Very much. I have one more question for you, Mick, and I've one or two for Alan before we finish up. We've just about 4 minutes left. So it's short as you can, the answer: will improving an individual farmer's carbon footprint put more money in his pocket ultimately?
So I suppose I kind of touched on the customer side of the piece and the market side of the piece, and we've kind of covered that off. But I suppose the short answer to that is yes, because I suppose you go back to the point that I made during the presentation. If you look at the carbon footprint for your farm, it's an efficiency measure for the farm. So the more efficient the farm is, the lower the carbon footprint is. The more efficient the farm is, the more cost effective it is, the more profitability it should leave behind. So if the short answer you're looking for, Vivian, I suppose yes would be it.
I suppose just to give our viewers a kind of a shortened version of what we're trying to say, I suppose, over the last hour, that if you're more efficient, your carbon footprint will be lower, so you'll be more profitable to claim. That's what we'd like to hear. A couple of questions to Adam before we finish up. How can 2-year-old calving in Suckler herds reduce emissions?
Yeah, well, I suppose, Vivian, look, you're going to have more output there from the heifer over her lifetime, because you have a calf straight away. So if you were looking at 2 different cows, Vivian, that you had there, and if they were both culled after 5 calvings, like, you've had 5 calves out of both of the cows, but one of the cows is going to be 6 months older when she's being culled as well. So she's producing emissions. Like, it's kind of the same as the reduced slaughter age as well. Every day that animal is there, every month that animal is there extra and being unproductive, they're producing emissions. And I kind of was trying to highlight there at the very beginning, like, methane is the biggest problem that we have. So anything that we can do to reduce that inefficiency. So that's the biggest thing, that there's more output there from the heifer over her lifetime. There's other advantages too, Vivian. You'll have less groups of stock too, which makes it easier from a grassland point of view as well too. So that's the kind of short answer there, Vivian, anyways.
Okay, and I suppose the direct question is, and for some farmers maybe have been fearful of this over time, but maybe it's the time to realise it, because I know you mentioned weaning efficiency, but generally, not always, but generally 2-year-old animals would be somewhat lighter and smaller than a 3-year-old animal calving down. So you have a smaller animal to feed, and hopefully if your efficiency is good, she'll wean. Maybe a calf is heavier, possibly heavier. So I suppose that's to be factored in as well. Yeah. And it's actually one on a suckler to weaning farm. It's where one of the big gains is to be got in terms of efficiency here and reducing emissions. Yeah, the national average for calving age, I think, is still 31 to 2 months, which
30, yeah,
over
30.
Work on, yeah. The last one, Alan, before I hand back to Brendan, how does Ireland compare to other countries when it comes to overall beef emissions?
Well, we're good, and I suppose that's why it's a sort of a good story that we can tell. Like, you know, I think we're about 5th on the EU average, and again, just going on figures that Paul Crossan had, he was kind of saying that we're kind of around 20, and I think, Mick, you might confirm that, around 20 anyways, of kilos of CO2 equivalents. Now, that's per carcass, kilo of carcass. I think the figures that Mick had in his report is on a live weight basis. But if you were to compare that with global average is somewhere in the mid-40s. So we're very good from that point of view, Vivian. So that's why we have a good story to tell from a beef point of view, and it's probably a positive to finish off. But at the same time, as we highlighted at the very beginning, like, agriculture accounts for a lot of our emissions, so we still have to keep striving to improve the story, because if other sectors, we'll say transport and energy, keep improving, then the finger will be pointed a little bit more at agriculture. So it's important we get our house in order and keep improving. But we have a good story to tell there, Vivian, and we are efficient versus other EU and world countries or global countries.
Okay, so we put certain we make more progress. Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
I'll hand back to Brendan to conclude.
Thank you very much, Vivian. So we're just about out of time there, folks. This evening, I'd like to thank our two panellists there, Michael Houlihan there from Bord Bia, and indeed Alan Nolan there, Teagasc advisor here in Ballinrobe. And indeed, thanks to you at home this evening for engaging with us on this webinar. We will be getting the recording uploaded to the Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel in the coming days, so keep an eye out for that. All that's left for me to say is I will be back again next Wednesday night for episode 2 of the 5-week webinar series. And indeed, next week we'll be discussing how to get the best value out of fertilisers this spring, with well-known soil specialist from Teagasc, Mark Plunkett, joining us as our guest speaker next week. So definitely tune in for that webinar next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. And indeed, look at all that's left for us to say is say good night for us all here in Teagasc and Ballinrobe. And indeed, stay safe, folks, and see you again next week. Bye, folks.
Night.
Night.